Hello, everyone, and welcome to GovCon Roundup Live, episode 11. My name is Carroll Bernard, co-founder here at Waypoint America LLC and Govology.com, and I'm going to be joined by two awesome guests today. One is my co-host, Mr. Stephen Koprince. Stephen is a retired GovCon attorney, the former owner of the law firm of Koprince McCall Pottroff LLC. And just a really great guy all around. And definitely, if you guys have been around the GovCon space, he's got a bit of a fan following. So I'd like to welcome Stephen here today. And I also would like to welcome our special guest, who is also a GovCon attorney and equity partner at the law firm of Koprince McCall Pottroff LLC, who, by the way, is also a show sponsor and one of our trusted legal partners, Ms. Nicole Pottroff. Nicole also, in addition to what she does as an attorney, she's been an instructor with us for a long time, and also my personal go-to GovCon attorney when I need counsel. So, Nicole, it's great to have you here with us today, and Stephen, welcome back.
It's great to be here, Carol, as always. Thank you for the kind words. And I will mention, by the way, that this is a great show to have Nicole, in addition to her many accolades. She has been quoted at length multiple times in the Washington Post on the 8A program. So she is a true expert in this area, and I'm really fortunate as a friend and partner here to talk with us about 8A and WSB today.
Let's get started. So this is episode 11, and as Stephen mentioned, we're going to be talking about two programs. One program we want to talk about today is the WOSB and the EDWOSB SBA programs. And when we say programs, we mean the programs and then the certifications that go along with those particular programs. We're also going to be talking a lot about the 8A program, which is probably going to dominate most of the conversation because there's been a historical and monumental shift that has just happened on Monday. There was a pending rule. That rule is now final. So we're going to talk about what's in that final rule and what do contractors need to know going forward for those of you guys who may already be in the program, for those of you guys who may have already applied for the program, and for those of you guys who want to apply and to understand if you might be eligible under the new definitions and criteria set forth now by the SBA under this final rule. So let's get started with the WOSB program. And Nicole, I would like to go to you first to give us an update on the WOSB program, because there was a bill that we were tracking that looked like it was going to, if passed, would eliminate the WOSB program, but not only that, eliminate the 8A program. I don't think that bill's going to come to life, but I could see where it could be concerning to certain WOSBs who are looking to apply. So could you tell us just a quick update on where we are with the WOSB program as it stands today?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you both for the very kind introduction. So the WOSB program, there's an economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business program at WOSB, and then the WOSB program. Like the 8A program, they are all creatures of statute. We have seen a lot of changes in the regulations and for the 8A now, but there is still the statutory basis for these programs out there. And recently we have seen these companion bills, one from the House, one from the Senate. Ending Discrimination in Government Contracting is what they are titled, and they would have massive impacts, not only removing, essentially eliminating the programs, or at least any preferences for those programs, but even things like subcontractor preferences for those programs, and taking away even potentially some of the state issued programs. So Carroll said, we've got these companion bills, and most people would tell you they don't think these are likely to pass. The main reason I personally think they're concerning, and others might feel the same way, is I think that they mark some of the tone of some of the recent representatives and the fact that we're probably going to see a lot more. So these ones are very extreme, and I think that's part of the reason that most people are not expecting them to pass, but they very much could lead to revised bills that are just a little different, that maybe aren't as extreme, that could do these same things down the line. And I think that's the biggest concern, is not so much that these ones will pass, but that these might be the start of more, the introduction to other bills. And we'll get into more details and stuff, and I would love to hear what everyone's questions are on this. But for the most part, these bills would change statute. They would be statutory changes, and they would affect a lot of acts that are already in place. The Small Business Act is not the only one. There's Minority Business Development Act, even some of the Relief and Rescue Plan acts that are out there that have certain preferences in them. Department of Transportation talked a little bit about state implementation of that. And so currently, the disadvantaged business goal is 5%, and it was higher under prior administration, but the 15% it got all the way up to has now been basically knocked back down to 5% by some of the changes implemented by the current administration, which really that is actually the source of most of these changes, tends to point back to the executive order that had this removal of DEI type tone to it and went into what the current administration would like to see. And then these bills actually talk about the direct changes that they would have on the acts, and even NASA contracting goals. Yeah, lots of contracting goals would be affected by this. So while they don't directly say we're going to delete from SBA's programs the WOSB and 8A program, they specifically have language talking about removing preferences based on gender and removing preferences based on disadvantaged status, race, ethnicity, all that stuff. So those speak directly to those contracting goals and would have a indirect effect of likely eliminating the programs if they were passed.
All right. Stephen, I know you and I just worked on a guide, which I'll probably be circling back with you to update it with me. So in this guide, what the suggestion was that we made for the WOSB firms was, look, go ahead and apply. The program is not dead. The government still does set asides. And if this bill happens to come to fruition, it will, but it may never. Is that still, we're aligned with that? And do you have anything to add in specifically to the WOSB program before we jump into the 8A program?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so I think that's where we are now. I agree with Nicole's take. I think these bills that are in Congress, there's one introduced in the House, the companion bill introduced in the Senate. They're essentially the same bill, one introduced in each chamber. I don't think either of those are going anywhere. Neither one of them has any co-sponsors, other reps who are willing to sign their name as a co-sponsor of these bills. But it does show that these programs, the Women-Owned Small Business Program, the 8A program, have political enemies and ones who are willing to put their names out there as, I oppose this program in an extreme way. And as Nicole said, that can be a starting point for potentially weakening the programs down the line at the statutory level. But right now, the programs are running pretty much, the Women-Owned Small Business Program at least is running pretty much as it always has. I don't think those bills are going anywhere. We have seen the SBA come in and do an audit of economically disadvantaged women-owned small businesses about whether they're economically qualified to be in that portion of the program. I think for women-owned small businesses, the bigger concern, and I'd still go ahead and apply because there's no reason not to, but the bigger concern I would have is just the usage of the program, because the SBA recently came out with its small business procurement scorecard for 2025, the 2025 fiscal year. The woman-owned small business goal is 5% of federal contracting dollars. The government almost never has gotten there, which is funny to me to think that we can't even get 5%, yet somehow it's discriminatory to try to push 5% to women. That's just my opinion. But the number went down. In fiscal year 2024, the government almost hit the 5% target. It got 4.97% of contracting dollars to WSBs. In 2025, the 2025 fiscal year, that was down to 4.52%. That's a pretty significant drop percentage-wise. There's also a drop in total dollars. It's still a go-ahead. There's no reason if you qualify not to get that certification, but there is some reason for concern, and there has been a long-standing reason for concern about whether the program is really being used enough, whether you're seeing enough set aside in sole sources. And the last thing I'd point out is that most of that 4.52% was awarded outside the women-owned small business program. In other words, when the government's saying we got 4.52% to women-owned small businesses, they're counting any way in which a women-owned small business won a contract, whether it's a small business set-aside, unrestricted, 8A, SDVOSB set-aside, et cetera. And so the number of contracts or the amount of contracts that are actually awarded using the WSB preference is less than 1%. And that continues to be a concern, I think, for women-owned small businesses. Depending on your industry, what agency you're going after, that certification may be more or less valuable. But it's not like tons and tons of dollars are being restricted for WSBs. It's less than 1%.
All righty. Great add to that. Let's move on to the 8A program. And definitely, this might be an exciting time for women-owned businesses to be able to maybe get access to the 8A program, whereas maybe before there was some very limited and specific criteria where maybe they didn't necessarily qualify. But I want to go over this, and I know we've got a lot of people on the call today. There's people that are probably in the program already. There's probably people that have applied to the program, are looking to apply to the program, and probably people brand new to GovCon. So, Stephen, could you give us, just in the nutshell, quick recap about what's kind of happened? What was the program initially? And then over the last 3 years, we've seen some kind of significant shifts to that, up to the point to where now we have a final rule that really changes both the definition of social disadvantage as well as the process contractors would use to apply for that program. So can you give us a little bit of a recap for the people that might just be brand new to 8A program and what that certification is, and maybe also in that, because it's tied with the SDB self-certification. So if they're now going to apply, they're probably going to self-certify as the SDB. Has that definition changed along with the 8A definition?
Yeah, great questions all along, and I'll look forward to hearing what Nicole has to add to this too. So big picture wise, let's start with the 8A program. And let's talk about first things first. There are two tracks in the 8A program. There's the individually owned track. That's for companies that are owned and controlled by individuals who are considered socially and economically disadvantaged. And then there's the entity owned track. And that's the track of certifications, which some people sometimes call Super 8As. You'll never hear the SBA say that themselves, but that's for your companies that are owned by Indian tribes, by Alaska Native corporations, by Native Hawaiian organizations, or community development corporations. So all the changes we're going to talk about today have to do only with the individual track. So if you're an entity-owned 8A, we can talk about the freeze on 8A applications. That part affects you, but the changes to the rules we're going to talk about have nothing to do with the entity-owned track. So we're only talking about the individual owned track. So individual owned track, what folks should know is that within that, there are a number of criteria that you have to satisfy to be eligible for 8A. And two of the key criteria are that the individual or individuals who own the majority stake in the company, at least 51%, and control the company, and those are terms of art and the regulations that we're not going to go into, although we have whole courses on what that stuff kind of means, must be considered what's called socially and economically disadvantaged. Those are two separate criteria. There's social disadvantage, economic disadvantage. So on the economic disadvantage side, that's a net worth and income test. We're not going to talk about that today. That hasn't changed. The social disadvantage is where the rubber hits the road. That's where the big change is coming. Again, that's one of the key criteria. It's not the only criteria for the 8A program, but it's one of the key criteria is that the individual or individuals who own and control the company, at least the 51% ownership, must be socially disadvantaged. What does that mean? And that's really where we are today. What does that mean? So before 2023, the SBA, following really a statutory scheme that was set out by Congress, had a two-tier approach to social disadvantage. And what the SBA essentially said, I'm oversimplifying a bit just because we don't want to spend too much time on background. What the SBA essentially said is, if you're a member of a certain group, and we're just going to name a bunch of groups in our regulation, then you essentially qualify. There may be some times where we ask you to prove something or that we could ask you for more evidence, but essentially you are presumed to be socially disadvantaged if you are a member of certain groups. And then the regulation just literally listed a bunch of groups, that Black Americans, certain Asian Americans, enrolled members of Native American tribes, and Americans with ethnicity background in certain countries, and started listing a bunch of countries. And so if you were fit within those groups, typically you had to do very little more than just be in that group to qualify as socially disadvantaged. You're done. If you did not fall within one of those categories, then you had to personally prove that you had experienced bias or discrimination as a result of your membership in some group. And that was the most often groups that I saw out there that were not presumed but were proving their personal disadvantage were women who are not of racial or ethnic background or national origin background that would allow them to take the presumption then, so Caucasian women, for example, and disabled individuals, including but not limited to disabled veterans who are saying, because of my disability, I was discriminated against. So that was the system prior to 2023. In 2023, a federal court in a case called Ultima struck down the presumption and said essentially that presumption is unconstitutional. You can't just list a bunch of groups and say that they're disadvantaged without meeting a very high constitutional threshold. In other words, when you have a racial threshold, an ethnic threshold in the law, it's not 100% prohibited by the Constitution, but the government has to meet a very high standard in order to draw that sort of line, and the court said that hadn't happened here. When Congress and then the SBA wrote these rules and said these groups are presumed disadvantaged, they hadn't met the high standard required by the Constitution. So the court wiped out essentially that presumed category, that idea that you could just say, I'm a Black American, so that's all I need to do. And the SBA said, okay, in that case, what we will do is just have everybody personally prove what like Caucasian women and disabled individuals previously had to do, that they personally had experienced bias or discrimination. using what's called a social disadvantage narrative to show that, hey, I, because of my circumstances, face discrimination here, there, and that narrative process was the one that was used for a couple of years following the Ultima case. About a year ago, the SBA kind of hit the brakes and said, you know what? We don't like this whole thing. We don't like the narratives. We don't like the underlying rules. Of course, we've had a change of administration, so there's a different philosophy at the top of the SBA now, and we are going to change the social disadvantage rules. We're going to change what it means to be socially disadvantaged in the regulations in a way that will still meet the statutory scheme. We're going to get rid of the presumption that the court already found invalid. They hadn't been applying the presumption, but we're going to wipe that out of our regs because it's an outdated, unenforceable reg because it's been found unconstitutional. But we're going to go farther than that. We're going to rewrite our regulation on social disadvantage, and that's where things stand. That's the rule we're talking about today is the result of the SBA saying, okay, in addition to getting rid of the presumption, which again they needed to do because it was unconstitutional and was not being used anyway for the last 3 years. But we're going to go beyond that. We're going to rewrite the standard to one that we think, in our view, current SBA leadership's view, administration's view, makes more sense and is a better fit for how we want this program to look. So that's where things stand today. That's my quick rundown. Nicole, what did I miss there? What do you want to add there?
I don't think you missed anything at all. I think you hit the nail on the head. So I'll turn it over to Carroll if there's anything in particular.
Yeah, so I've got a few questions, of course, for you guys, but let's start with you, Nicole. So let's take a look at that definition now, right? So we knew what the definition was previously as Stephen defined it. What does that definition now say in terms of social disadvantage? And the second part to that question is assuming that an individual has met all of the other criteria for what's going to be now the new 8A eligibility criteria. 51% ownership, they still have an economic component to that they've got to meet. So let's just say assuming all of that. So the first question again is, what is it? What's in the definition now? And who does that open up to? Does that open it up to all firms? And I'll have a couple of follow-on questions about the definition too, but I'm going to stop there.
So yeah, and I think the biggest thing is we saw the obvious, clear removal of the rebuttable presumption of social disadvantage. And that one didn't seem to surprise anyone. We all knew that was coming, as Stephen said, right around the time after the Ultima decision came down. We knew there would be a change to the regulations, which often takes a really long time. And that's where we're at right now. The thing I think that did surprise people, however, surprised us a little bit, is the change in the language regarding what they call the test for social disadvantage. And we can talk about what that says, but how it's going to work is really something I think we are all on the edge of our seats for to see how it will be implemented. I'm not even sure at this point if it's going to be through a narrative. SBA issued some really interesting guidance a while back and I blogged on it, but it was really vague and confusing and nobody quite knew what to make of it. Just essentially saying that they were implementing the current administration's anti-DEI policies and that there would no longer be a social disadvantage narrative. It wouldn't be asked for, it wouldn't be reviewed, etc. Now, since that, we've still been submitting narratives, helps a lot of people do so. That didn't have an immediate impact. What we're seeing now in this rule that may change even how you prove social disadvantage, and likely will, is it now includes this kind of, I would say, an additional category, but if you read the rule, you could almost read it as replacing prior categories. And again, that's where we need to see how things come out. But it talks about how the test for social disadvantage now would be a showing that within your lifetime, federal or state or local government or a university or a corporation, through any action, policy, rule, regulation, or other practice of any of its agencies, subsidiaries, authorized agents, discriminated or was biased against a clearly definable racial, ethnic, or cultural group of which the citizen is a member, or favored in any way a racial, ethnic, or cultural group of which the citizen is not a member, and that the discrimination or bias materially harmed the citizen. So that's a lot of words, but in a nutshell, this seems to encompass, I'm just going to say it frankly, like your typical cis white male in America, which up until this point, unless there was a unique aspect that could be cited in their narrative for social disadvantage, such as maybe a mental disability, even a physical disability. I had seen some based on sexual preference, some plenty based on gender, as Stephen pointed out. But it seems now that the regulation is taking into account anybody who had previously not been able to get into the 8A program because they were a cis white male. The language kind of flips that on its head by saying, even if a government, a corporation, and a university or anything favors in any way, that's broad, any kind of racial, ethnic, or cultural group of which the citizen is not a member, that as long as you can show material harm from that, you should be able to get in. So this does seem to open the doors up to, as you put it, Carroll, and truly any firm, if you can prove the material harm. And that is important. I think that's something that hasn't changed, is showing that material harm. It wasn't always called the material harm. It was more that chronic and substantial long-term negative impact, but same idea there. And so the question, I think, now is the rule intending to shift the focus from what would have been the standard, those with disabilities and those of the female gender and those with other unique things that set them apart, religion, heritage, things like that, toward everybody else who wasn't able to qualify before. And if you read just the beginning of the regulation and the way that they changed that language, that might be your takeaway. But I will say, we talked about this a little too before we got on today, but it's really interesting that it does go into some like examples. It does talk about gender. It does talk about disabilities. So hopefully, and what it sounds like is those things would still be included. And it sounds like the intent here is to just also open up the door to anybody, as funny and circular as it sounds, that was discriminated against because of a program trying to help those that were discriminated against. So I'm not really sure how to put that clearer, but yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how this test is measured and whether it is intending to shift the focus and shift who the program is for, or really truly just open the doors for more people.
Yeah. So let me just recap something. And I wanted to also just share how I think this is set out. And you guys can let me know if we're on the right track here in my thinking process anyway, which also I'm sure everybody else has the same question. So the previous program was based social disadvantage off of an individual's personal experience, and there was a presumption for 5 minority groups, I think it was, but that program was still open to anybody if you could meet the definition of discrimination as it was set forth in the previous. This new regulation, one of the significant things is that it basically, number one, it's no longer personal. So you don't have to say, I have personally been like somebody at my work or a contractor personally discriminated against me. And that's where the narratives came in for the old way, is that you would write that up and how you personally had received discrimination. Under the new system, if your group has received discrimination, racial, ethnic, or cultural group. Now, cultural group is going to be interesting to see how that is defined. Is that racial and ethnic's pretty clear? I'm guessing that women-owned small businesses would fall under a cultural group. I'm guessing veterans would fall under a cultural group. LGBTQ may fall under a cultural group. And so as we start to look at these groups, and so there's going to be a lot of groups. And I guess the test is that now, which group do you belong to? And can you see evidence based upon policies or something that you see that an entity or a government maybe had unfair or unequal treatment or discrimination against this particular group? You got to find some evidence of that somewhere, and then you take that and apply. Am I on the right lines here?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I'd love to get Nicole's thoughts on this too. There is a component to it where the evidence they want is, yes, they say we want evidence that you are a member of a group that has experienced some sort of of discrimination, bias, et cetera, by government, by corporate world, by educational institutions, et cetera. And then the proposed rule, and it continues to the final rule, the proposed rule basically said, go out to the internet, find these policies and such. And to me, that the way that at least the proposed rule was written seemed very clearly directed at people who had allegedly suffered discrimination because of DEI. Because what policies are available on the internet? DEI type policies are available on the internet. Policies saying we discriminate against women, we discriminate against minorities are generally not being published on the internet, right? And so there was definitely some concern by folks who had been more traditional 8A applicants saying, hey, I'm a Black American, I'm Native American, maybe I would have been helped by a DEI policy, but I don't see how I can show that I'm a member of a group. So the final rule does a couple things to, I think, ease some of those concerns. First, it says that the findings of Congress can be evidence that you are a member of a group that has experienced discrimination. And that's actually really important because in the commentary, the SBA then cites congressional statutes such as the Americans with Disability Act and says, Congress found that disabled Americans were being discriminated against by passing the ADA. And so now this provides potentially a roadmap for others because Congress has found a lot of folks that experience discrimination or are disadvantaged. For example, the underlying statute for the 8A program itself in the Small Business Act names Black Americans, Native Americans, certain Asian Americans, and others as socially disadvantaged. And then you've got groups such as you got the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, where Congress has found that there have been discrimination against workers above 40. So maybe I can apply now because I'm over 40. But there's plenty of groups where Congress has come in and made this finding that may give some relief to folks who say, I can't go on the internet and find evidence that a group has discriminated against me, because what you're really looking for is evidence of DEI policies that may be out there. These congressional findings may help. And then the SBA also said, and if you still can't find this stuff, you can have other evidence. I didn't tell you what the other evidence is. So this is one of those things that we'll have to see how it gets implemented. So that, depending on, again, how it's implemented, that suggests maybe we are broadening the category of people who can be admitted, so that at its extreme, it could end up just making the category almost irrelevant. So it's really just an economic disadvantage test with a little check the box exercise. I don't know if that's how it's going to be implemented. We'll see. But you could see it ultimately being that. The one caveat I would give is that the SBA rule does say that you have to certify that you personally experienced material harm as a result of the policy. And so it's not enough to just say, yeah, once upon a time, they discriminated against people over 40. I'm over 40, so let me in. You have to at least certify. It's not clear the level. They say it's a self-certification, but anytime you're self-certifying, in my experience in government contracting, you better have something backing that up in case someone audits you. To me, I would want to say, what do I have? What could I say was the harm that befell me because of this policy? Was there some job that I didn't get because maybe they hired a younger person if I'm going in and saying they discriminated against? I don't know. That kind of starting to sound like the prior rule. So we'll have to see how that plays out. The final thing I'd add on that is that in the final rule here, they basically said that not taking an action could be evidence that you had material harm. In other words, I wanted to apply to the 8A program, but I called Nicole, who said, hey, you're a white dude, you're not getting in. So most likely. And so I didn't do it. And so that's my material harm, because I was advised by an expert not to go forward because I don't have, under the old rule, a category that would fit me. I don't have a disability or some other category that I would fit in neatly that would likely get me in. There may be folks who are able to say my material harm is that I didn't apply for the program. I didn't do this, that, or the other. And that harmed me because I didn't think that they would let me in. They didn't think that they would get the job. I didn't think that. But it really, on this material harm thing, there's not much guidance given in the regs. So we're really going to have to wait and see how that is implemented before we can have a better sense as to what SBA is looking for and what you really need to have to back up your self-certification.
Oh, yeah, that's very interesting. One of the things you mentioned specifically about the 8A program, which I think that's going to be the big question now, is was the previous version of the 8A program a program that could be pointed to as giving favoritism to certain individuals over other, or certain groups over other groups? And when I think about this, I think about my days back at the SBA. And just one example, I had a contractor, he was in forestry, white guy, and the Forest Service in Oregon and Washington State pretty much did most of their contracts to 8A. So he felt very unfairly disadvantaged by the fact that, and he was a veteran and service disabled veteran, but they continued to go out 8A time and time again. And so he was very frustrated. He even heckled me at a conference once. He was so upset about it, but it was what it was at the time. Is that something, Nicole, that if you had that guy now who was coming to you to say, I want to get in this program, I do feel like I was not given a fair advantage to the contracts that were let out through the 8A program. There's also educational opportunities that were provided to the 8A firms through 7J and other training programs that I didn't have access to. Is that something that you would maybe think that your client now would have a basis for applying and getting accepted into the program?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think that some of the answer might come to us from this SBA guidance that we got, this mysterious SBA guidance that we got that I had mentioned. And I can pop a link in there to a blog as well in case anybody's interested. But this was, I'm trying to figure out when, but it wasn't too long ago. I blogged on it, let's see, shortly after it came out. So January. And so this guidance from SBA that talked about the 8A program implementing the anti-DEI executive order and things like that, I think lends to the answer of yes. And I don't know how this guidance is supposed to be read with the most recent rule, if it's supposed to be cohesive or if it's something where they weren't sure how they were implementing it and now the statute is a certainty. Unfortunately, even in statutory interpretation and things like that, we're not given a whole lot of information on if an agency just issues guidance or policy and exactly how that would impact things. As we know, statute's going to have an impact no matter what, and regulations are going to have an impact when those are changed. But it's a little more gray area when it comes to just, here's our policy, here's what we're doing, which is exactly what we saw with Ultima implementation at first. Is what SBA did is basically said, ignore our regulations. We're no longer doing the presumption of social disadvantage. This is what we're doing. But this guidance that came out in January literally talks about no applicant to the 8A program should be denied or given any presumptive preference based solely on race. It talks about the social disadvantage narrative and again says they're not really planning to use that anymore. And it's, again, a really interesting read, and I would be curious what everybody's take on it once everyone gets a chance to read it. But it does seem to imply that if you had not been allowed into the 8A program before, that you should be allowed in, or at least be able to consider that as part of your basis of social disadvantage. And absolutely, I'm always going to try to make it a half full glass, whether I agree with the change or not. So any of my clients that are of a cis white male type group and maybe we're arguing based on a disability or something, I'm at least going to recommend that we add in that maybe you never applied to the 8A program for these reasons, yet you watched other 8A contractors receive contracts and benefits and all kinds of things, which also goes to what Stephen pointed out. And what is really interesting is it does seem to go more for the group. It's targeted at groups as far as showing a discriminated group or a unfairly treated group. But it does sound a lot more like the narrative when it comes to that material harm. It talks about the individual impacts, and it makes it sound like that's still going to be a pretty high bar and you have to show personal and individual harm. But as was also pointed out, it says the failure or the lack of your ability to apply or the lack of an action can actually be used. What's to stop anybody from saying, I would have probably applied to the 8A program, or I would have probably gone to this university or done this. And it's those aspects of the rule that even though it did add in, you can establish discrimination based on a congressional finding, which I agree with Stephen is huge, such an important thing to make sure that we're not, and I think the point he was getting at too is you don't have reports out there for the most part of a corporation, an agency, the government, anyone saying we don't award to people of a certain religion, or we won't include people of a certain gender, or we won't include you at all if you have a disability. So when we're going to the publicly available proof out there of discrimination, it really does seem to be only talking about the groups where you can go say, look, this university had a preference program for certain races or genders. This 8A program, I was told I probably couldn't get in, or I read a blog that said I probably couldn't get in, and I didn't apply. So it is going to be very interesting to see how this is implemented and whether you're going to be able to make those arguments about material harm pretty much solely based on I didn't do something. Because if that's all, then again, I'm not sure what really stops anybody. You do have to be careful anytime you make a statement to the federal government, but I'm not sure how you could ever kind of disprove that somebody might have done something had things been different.
Yeah, the way I'm seeing it, I don't know, I could be wrong, but it's almost like, and we'll, I guess, have to see what happens in the rollout, which, by the way, this rule actually is supposed to become final on September 10th, correct? And then maybe we'll see some additional information come out from the SBA. But Stephen, I want to go to you along the lines of what we were talking about with Nicole and the previous program as it was, and also the current 8A program, but folks that are in it now. I've had people tell me that they don't feel like it's fair. And we've talked about the parity of the programs. And one of the things unique to the 8A business development program is the ability to have sole source contracts without the contracting officer having to have a justification or putting out market research to say, we're going to do a sole source like what happens with the WOSB program. Yeah, there's sole source language, but it's okay, we're going to put it out to see if we can make a set aside. And if one person responds, then we could do a sole source. That's completely different than what it is in the 8A programs. The only one that basically the contracting officers can say, we're just going to use this because it's part of the business development program. And the unique benefit about that is that with the struggle of all contractors new coming in, having lack of past experience and past performance, these sole source contracts are a way that they start to get some of that past experience and past performance. Could somebody make a case that if they're not in the program and don't get that same contracting advantage, effectively they're eligible for the program?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah, I think it's first important to understand just what you say there. Why is the 8A program so important? Why, for example, would a woman-owned small business be so eager to get 8A certification when there's that woman-owned small business program? As I alluded to earlier, there's actually not a whole lot of dollars necessarily going out under the woman-owned small business certification versus 8A. And one of the key reasons for that is that 8A just has a much more powerful sole source component. It's more powerful in two ways. One, there's no dollar value attached sole source awards to these entity-owned 8As like Alaska Native Corporation, not necessarily relevant to our discussion today. But the second reason is that in the other preference programs, the SBA, other contracting preference programs such as Women-Owned Small Business, SDVOSB, HubZone, the sole source authority is not only capped at certain dollar values, but the contracting officer can only use that authority when the contracting officer has that market research to demonstrate that there's not a reasonable likelihood of getting at least two competitive offers if they competed it. And what that means is that in a lot of cases, they find two of them. They're like, I guess we got to compete this thing. 8A, they could have 50 likely offers, and they'll just like, nope, we like company X. They're qualified, they're capable, they got a reasonable price. We're going with company X. And so it's an easy button for a lot of contracting officers to issue these 8A sole source awards, and they're able to do that, and the numbers are just extraordinary. I think I published some on my blog. I don't recall the numbers off the top of my head, but the number of sole source dollars going through 8A far outstretched, 40 times or 50 times higher than the next program down the chain. I mean, it's unreal how many sole source dollars are issued under that program. So yeah, I think that what the SBA is getting at in its rule is that not being in the 8A program, not having applied to that program, not being part of that program, even if you are part of eligible for one or more other programs, such as Women-Owned Small Business, such as HubZone, such as SDVOSB, that in and of itself could be a material harm because I wasn't allowed into that program. You're still going to have to tie that back to some sort of discrimination or bias against a certain group. I think you're going to still have to tie that to something as part of that first piece of the rule that says you have to show that there was a policy of some sort or bias or discrimination against a group of which you're a member of. But once you did that, the part where you didn't apply to 8A, got denied to 8A, et cetera, absolutely. I think that the SBA is very clear that could be a material harm because of the value of this program and its unique advantages in the government contracting market.
Which goes back to a question like, are service disabled veteran certified firms, are WOSB certified firms in and of themselves a cultural group? So
yeah.
like, this is going to be interesting because those groups don't have the same advantage. And unless SBA comes out and says, hey, we're going to let the sole source authority apply equally across the 8A, SDVOSB, HubZone, and maybe the WOSB program, it still seems like 8A is a bit of a lopsided advantage, if you will.
Yeah, I was just going to add one interesting note. Yeah, I think that a lot of folks are going to come out with these groups, women-owned, veterans potentially, and we'll see. We'll have to see what SBA accepts. I heard someone say, what about military spouses? We're put in an environment where we're often moving base to base and can't get long-term employment. It's hard. So are we not a discriminated group? Could just the category of a military spouse be a cultural group that has experienced bias or discrimination? So there's going to be a lot to unpack, and I think a lot of groups are going to be trying to make that showing to SBA moving forward. Some that we can think of kind of off the top of our heads, and others that are going to be a little more creative, I would suspect.
Yeah, I was just going to add, so I was looking for this line in that guidance when I was talking about it earlier, but it actually says directly that the SBA Office of Government Contracting and Business Development should further consider, for example, whether an individual was formally or in practice excluded from the SBA's 8A program while the unconstitutional laws, policies, and practices were in effect, directly speaking to the 8A program excluding you. And the other interesting thing, just to further support what Stephen was talking about, how much more robust the sole source in the 8A program, the sole source program is itself. I cannot tell you, I can't count how many times someone has come to me seeking 8A status and saying, I was directly told by a contracting officer, we could get a sole source award, but only if we get our 8A status.
Yeah.
And many of them had other statuses.
Sometimes
I have that all the time. Yep.
Yeah. And not to mention, you mentioned earlier, I think, Nicole, the previous administration went from a 5% to a 15% goal with SDB, but all of the other socioeconomic certifications didn't move up. So this is going to be very interesting to see how this unfolds. Again, I guess we're going to basically see more come from the SBA as they move closer to September 12th when this rule becomes final. What advice would you give? Oh, by the way, let's talk about the firms that have already applied. What would you advise, Nicole, clients? I'm sure you've probably already had clients that have come to you and said, hey, I've applied. There's a new standard. What do I do now? Do I rescind my application and resubmit it to try to under a new standard? But we don't know exactly how that looks just yet. But what are you kind of telling your clients?
And it's a great question because I would say at any given time, historically, the number of clients we have pending 8A certification or denial, whatever, but pending a decision on their 8A application is probably higher now than maybe it's ever been. And I think that's possibly due to, even like we were talking about, the benefits may have even been greater before there was a higher number, but there's a massive backlog. I've seen everything from an SBA email that they're understaffed and not processing applications at this time to people coming to me and saying, I have SBA flat out told me to pull my 8A application and get my WOSB handled first or get my SDVOSB handled first. Because under the new certification program, we thought it was an amazing benefit. You can apply for pretty much everything you're eligible for at the same time. But I've seen multiple emails and notifications from SBA telling people, look, it's going to be a long time before you get an answer on this 8A. And I'm not sure why they can't simultaneously do those things, but they've said, if you pull the 8A part of it and reapply later, then we can process everything else in a matter of weeks, super quickly. You could have these other statuses. So there's a lot of people right now pending a decision from SBA. And so the implementation of the new rule, the regulation, it does talk about how it doesn't apply to current 8A participants, meaning you would not have to re-demonstrate social disadvantage if you already demonstrated it. But that is a participant. It specifically says this new test is going to apply to any individually owned firms that have already applied but have not yet been certified. And what I would advise there is a great question, because I often say when it comes to 8A applications, when it comes to things like economic disadvantage, sometimes social disadvantage, but because you don't generally get a hard yes or a hard no from SBA right off the bat, you tend to get, I think one time ever did I see a situation where someone told me they were just denied with no back and forth. For the most part, you get SBA comes back and says, we have questions about this part of your finances. We want you to elaborate on this instance in your narrative. And so very often I actually do tell my clients, rather than if they come to me and want to know if they're eligible, where their issues might be, it's not necessarily financially smart for me to do a full evaluation of all of your criteria, make sure that everything matches, and then have you apply, when SBA will basically be doing that and giving you a chance to provide some elaboration or feedback or answer some things. So I limit what I typically do initially with my clients to the things that I know with confidence I can pull the red flag and fix very likely, or change or whatever, tell them you cannot get in based on this. So I let SBA do the work there. So here it's interesting, because I think I would advise any people with an outstanding application to make some changes to the narrative. But as you mentioned, Carroll, we don't know how this is going to be implemented, and it may not be a narrative at all. And these narratives, they've gone from write anything you want, as many pages as you want, to we only want to see a couple pages, to how about just answer these questions in these boxes, back to give us everything you've got again. I think I call it a saga in one of my blogs. I'm proud of myself for that. It's really been interesting, and they can take 10, 20 hours of legal services. That is, I hate disadvantaged businesses also proving they're economically disadvantaged, then having to drop that much money on a narrative. A part of me wants to just wait and see how this gets implemented, but I don't want to risk anybody getting denied right off the bat for not including the specific test the way that it's stated here.
Yeah, I know we're getting close to the end of the hour, but I just also want to make a note, maybe toss out one last question to you, Stephen, or any of the minority-owned businesses or the previous firms who would have maybe already been eligible under the previous standard. It doesn't mean that they're out or excluded. They are just going to have to look for a different type of justification to come into the program and different evidence. And I'm sure they'll probably be able to find that evidence, because there's a lot we know, and we understand why the SBA initially had the presumptive disadvantage of the 5 groups. But what is your take on that?
Yeah, and let me just add one thing that I think is of interest to piggyback off Nicole, and I'll pivot to that. SBA was very clear in its final rule that the new test does not apply to existing 8A participants, which I think they're probably breathing a sigh of relief. However, it did not explain how that fits with its own regulations, because its own regulation for annual reviews, and those who are in the program know what I'm talking about with your annual review by SBA, says that you have to, as part of that review, certify that you meet all the requirements set forth in, and then they list about 10 different regulations, including 13 CFR 124.103, which is where the new test is going to be found. And so seems to me that if they require that exact certification as it is, existing participants are still going to have to certify that they meet the new test. So I would love SBA to explain the disconnect between those two, and I'm sure that will be part of the process moving forward. But if I were a current participant, I would be happy that I don't necessarily, according to SBA's commentary, have to worry about this now, but I'd also keep in the back of my mind that could change, because there is a regulation that says as part of your annual review, you have to certify you meet the current requirements. And as of September 10th, these are going to be the current requirements. To pivot to your question, yeah, I think that if this final rule clearly is going to open the door to 8A to firms that had trouble getting in before, I think that's SBA's clear intent. They're saying as part of our anti-DEI initiatives, we don't want a program in which certain categories of folks are being excluded based on their race or ethnicity. Okay. That to me does not mean that folks who might have applied under the old rule, who have more traditional eligibility profile, are going to be excluded or should be excluded. Because I think the way the rule is written, especially when you add in that findings of Congress piece, means that, to me, it's likely, although I can't say in each individual case, but it's likely that if you met the old test, you can find the evidence to meet the new test. And that's where I would be aiming if I were in that boat of the folks who, by the way, the SBA's frozen 8A applications for a year. Been a year since they processed a new application, and we've heard some hemming and hawing as to why, but let me put my 2 cents out there. Probably because they didn't want to admit anyone under a standard they didn't like, at least in part. And so they don't like this current social disadvantage test. So I'm hopeful that big a mess as this is changing the rules, that getting this on the books means that we're going to get that backlog fixed, that the SBA's got a test it likes now, and it can move forward with applications, at least as written, and we'll have to see how it is implemented. I think that if you met the old test, then you're likely to be able to meet the new one. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have everything at hand right now. You may have to do some research and talk to someone like Nicole or someone else who's helping you with these applications, and you may need to see how things shake out in terms of how SBA is going to put forth requests for information from its current applicant pool. But I suspect that if you met the old test, you will likely, although I can't give a definitive answer, be able to find what you need to meet the new one. So that's my hope. I'm keeping my fingers crossed because a lot of folks have a lot of time and effort invested in an application that's been sitting at SBA for a long time.
Just to quickly add on to that. So 2 quick points. One, I do agree. I think you should be able to find what you need to meet the current test. In fact, it's interesting to me because in the past, when making these arguments for these narratives, SBA had a really strong focus on how personal it was. And I know we did talk about that already, but they didn't want to see things like under the ADA, under the American Disability Act. They didn't want to see, oh, gender discrimination is a real thing for everybody. Here's why. So it's unlikely that if you had a compliant SBA would like your narrative before, that it's going to have everything it needs in it now. So I do agree too with Stephen. You probably do need to talk to somebody about whether it's us, whether it's PTAC, whether it's anyone out there, but you need to talk to somebody about how to make those changes, because I had seen narratives sent back where all we had was an introduction briefly noting that this was a widespread type of discrimination and then going into the personal aspect of it. And SBA has said, nope, we don't want to see this widespread part here at all. And so I find that really interesting now because that's exactly what they're looking for. And then the only other point I was going to make is, as Stephen mentioned, they were clear that it shouldn't apply to existing participants. But when Ultima came down and they changed the regulations to, they didn't change the regs yet, but they did this policy of now everybody has to do a narrative. I found it really interesting that they immediately applied that even to existing. You could have been 8 years in the 8A program and been told, hey, guess what? Based on this new court order and policy, you have to write a narrative if you want to stay in this program for your final year. And so it is, I am cautiously optimistic for the current participants that maybe it won't impact them, but I had really, truly not yet thought of the annual renewal aspect of certifying that you meet all of those regulations. So it will be really interesting since previously they had applied it to current participants when they made changes.
That is one of the first things I actually thought of, because I used to work as the guy at the SBA Portland District office that would review those annual applications. And when you're reviewing those annual applications, you're reviewing that person is still eligible under the program according to the law. I'm not sure how that will go now that there's been changes to this, but I guess we will see. And so it'll be interested to stay tuned. Stephen, do you have anything before we close the session today?
Oh, I think I've blabbed on enough. Folks want to get to their questions, so I'll let us get to those.
As we close, I would just like to thank Stephen Koprince. I'd like to thank Nicole, as well as for the law firm of Koprince McCall Pottroff LLC for being a sponsor and trusted partner, both of this show as well as in general with all of the stuff that we do at Govology. Thank you guys. I'd like to thank those of you guys who showed up for being here. We're also going to have some resources for you in the show notes. Check those links to Stephen's blog, the Koprince McCall Pottroff blog called smallgovcon.com. Great 2 ways to stay up to date. And I know that they're going to be posting updates as they come out with more information. We're going to be doing some webinars on these subjects at govology.com. So if you're already a member, you should get emails from us. Just watch the emails. We're going to do some webinars in the fall. And I wouldn't be surprised if we got back, the 3 of us, to see maybe in November or something where things stand as of then. And maybe we'll be able to give more guidance for folks. But we'll see some guidance from the SBA soon. So you guys just be on the lookout. With that, we'll close this episode of GovCon Roundup Live. Thank you for watching.